It's a matter of getting close to the mic.
Okay, folks, I present our favorite friend, Ned Shultz, is going to do a presentation on Korea and Japan. Go ahead, take it away, Ned.
Actually, I was one of the top PCVs in Busan in 1966. So I'll take it from there. I was away when suddenly Diane asked me if I was on for today. So I tried to think what I was going to talk about. And I gave you something like Japan and Korea, past and present. And then I came home. Yeah, you can't hear me?
Almost not.
Wow.
I can hear
Get
you.
closer to
Ned.
the microphone. It seems to make a big difference.
Once again, when I what?
When you get closer to your microphone, you're much more audible.
Yes,
Okay, how is this better?
Yes.
it's audible.
All right, well, not better, but audible. Okay. Anyway, to cut to the chase, I'm really going to be talking about a historical perspective on Japan and Korean relations. And we're going to sort of go through, and of course, we start with geography, which is why I always begin. And this is a view of the world, or at least Asian world, back in the 16th century. And it sort of gives you an idea that, yeah, Japan and Korea maybe were neighbors, but it's not very close. But Japan and Korea really share a lot of things. Climatically, you know, Northeast Asia, hot summers, cold winters, tremendous appreciation for nature, love for beauty and whatnot. And this is from the past, and this is to the present. But if we go way back, we're quite aware that there were land bridges that connected the islands and the peninsula. And this is roughly maybe 10,000 to 15,000 years ago. So it's quite easy to traverse from what we know of the peninsula today over to the islands. And linguistically, and I should yield the floor to Ed at this point, but linguistically, there was also a great deal of contact between Korea and Japan. Korea, I believe, Japan and Korea are both, I believe, still called Altaic languages. And they have very similar grammar structures. Their word order is very similar. And for those of you who have learned both Korean and Japanese, whichever you learned first really made learning the second one that much faster, because it's really because of the word order, the way they phrase things, you can pick up one language and the other quite readily. Early times, this is sort of a map showing migrations into Korea. But there was lots of migrations that came into Korea, and some of these migrations also moved on into Japan. And we know from the Neolithic period, and Neolithic, by the way, means New Stone Age, there are a lot of similarities found both in the peninsula, i.e. Korea, and the archipelago, the islands, meaning Japan. And I think it's important to realize at earliest times, it's incorrect to try to say this is Korean, this is Japanese. That only evolves later. But in these early periods, people did not consider themselves Korean or Japanese. They basically considered themselves people of Northeast Asia. And if you see on the left, that's one of the dolmens on Kanghwa Island, which if you go to now, it's in a major national park. But dolmens were a very common part of East Korean culture, as you know, and they also had a lot of jar burials. And if you go over to Japan, especially around Fukuoka, you find examples of these jar burials, which were also very current in the islands. Now, if you look at the earliest myths, am I going too fast, by the way?
No, you're doing great.
Okay.
Was that last photo, was that Amsari?
No.
It was somewhere else?
Last photo was in Fukuoka. And
Okay.
The dolmen was in Kanghwa Island, and Fukuoka was where the jar burials are.
Okay, great.
Now, another way to see the similarities in the two cultures is to look at the earliest myths. And certainly if we all know of Japan, how they focus on the sun and the sun goddess, and how that is so prime in the Japanese myth, but also in the earliest Korean myths. For example, Jumong is heated, is warmed by the sun, and it comes forward. And so we see the importance of sun myths. We also see the idea of the bear as sort of having this godlike pretensions. And if you think of the Tangun myth, the bear figures loud and large in that. And the word for bear is gom, as you probably know, and that's very similar in sounding to gami. And gami is also means spirit. And so people see a lot of relationships back and forth in those areas. We also have the egg myths. And for those of you who are familiar with Pak Yakose, he was from an egg, and out of him came Pak, otherwise gourd, bark, Pak, and that was the founding of Shilla. And for those of you who know about Momotaro, he was the peach boy, and he came from an egg also, a peach from a peach, and was warmed by the sun, and out he came, and he was a great hero. And so it just shows you sun, gods, egg myths, sort of link these two different areas into one basic cultural sphere. And along with that, in Korea, you had shamanism, and the Japanese called it Shinto. But Shinto is basically shamanism, and shamanism is basically Shinto. So again, you see in terms of the earliest myths and religious beliefs, a great deal of similarity. Around 300 BCE, you have the beginning of what's known as the Yayoi age. It's roughly a 600 period from 300 BCE to 300 CE. And it's during this time that you see massive migrations from the peninsula going to the islands. And with this massive migrations comes the rice culture. The Koreans were already practicing the rice culture before this. They basically, the people on the Korean peninsula, I don't want to call them Koreans, the peninsula people were already practicing rice culture, and they take it over to Japan. And it's really a time of major influx of people from the peninsula coming over to the islands. It's at the same time, or right at the end of the Yayoi period, you have the Bronze Age coming in. And the Bronze Age, of course, brings more changes. Bronze is better as an implement. Bronze is stronger. It has an impact in agriculture. And this brings major changes not only to the people on the peninsula, but also on the islands. And by the way, this is a mirror. And my students always say, why is it a mirror? And it's a mirror because the mirror is on the other side of this implement. If you look at this, all you see is this beautiful design. And if you turn the mirror around, what do you see? You. So anyway, in case you're wondering what that is a mirror. Now, at this time, we begin to hear a lot about kaya and mimana. And the Japanese early on talked about how kaya was settled from Japan. In other words, this argument came forward in the 1910s and 1920s as Japanese scholars were trying to justify why they had to come to Korea to colonize Korea. And they developed this idea that Mimana was actually a Japanese colony set up in Kaya to bring culture to the islands. That's total myth. It didn't happen at all. If anything, the culture moves, as you can see, from what we call the Kaya area, which is centered around Kimhae, over to the islands. And again, I look at this period as being sort of a great cultural sphere in which you have the peninsula and the islands, and people are going back and forth. And for those of us who lived in Busan knew if we needed to look at Japan, we would just go out to Taejongdae, and there we would see Japan off in the distance. It's visually that close. And so the whole whole area of Southeast Korea could go back and forth to the islands. And so there was this great interchange that went on between the two. Roughly about the end of the 4th century, the beginning of the 5th century, there was a great king in Goguryeo called Hwanggaeto. And I only bring this in because this is a stele that was erected up in Manchuria today, which talks about how Hwanggaeto helped defeat the Wa being the Japanese who had come over to Korea. And so you begin to see the people, different forces looking upon the Japanese possibly as an invading force. I just bring that in to add a little detail. Now, one of the great theories which I really enjoyed was the horse rider thesis. And this was forwarded by Gary Ledry. And I think some of you are probably aware he literally just died a day or so ago. And he was one of the early specialists in Korean studies. He had a very great imagination. He thought of all sorts of different things. And he sort of expounded on what he called the horse rider thesis. It's been debunked, it's been challenged, but the basic idea is beginning in the 4th century, you began to have major people moving out of Puyo into Paekje and on over to Japan, bringing the culture. And this fits with what we saw already in terms of the Yayoi culture of people moving in very quickly. And what they brought was the ability to ride on horses. These people were warriors, and they brought in a whole new idea of leadership. And some people go even so far as to say they brought the idea of an imperial system. Because shortly after the 4th century, going into the 5th century, we begin to see the rise of an imperial order. And there are times when the Emperor of Japan is even admitted to his Korean roots. But again, at this time in the 4th and 5th century, they weren't thinking of themselves as being Koreans or Japanese. They're thinking of themselves as just being people trying to live and make the best of things. Moving
And
ahead.
can I add one thing there?
Sure.
The Koma Shrine, where they were thatching the first roof I ever saw, is from Koguryo, and they still have ties with Korea and the imperial family. And that thatching was being done because the crown prince was going to come to visit.
Aha.
Could I add something to Ned? I didn't have a chance to look for the source, but fairly recently, there's been a well-received thesis that early on the Korean Peninsula, exactly when I'm not sure, but about the time rice was appearing, it appears that there may have been Japonic speakers as well as whatever the Korean word is, Koreanic speakers, in other on the Korean Peninsula simultaneously. And anyway, I just wanted to throw that out.
That would fit with the idea that people are going back and forth between the islands and the peninsula. Not necessarily out of aggression, but out of, your cousin lives in Kimhae. You're living over in Fukuoka. Go visit your cousin. You become a Japan.
I think the theory was out of the Laotung Peninsula, out of that area, some of the rice agriculture was transported to the Korean Peninsula by Japonic speakers. And it's kind of an upsetting idea to me because that's not the way I've understood it. But anyway, I just wanted to throw that out.
No, if you can find the article, I really enjoy reading it.
I'll send the book to you. I have a copy of the book.
And we do know that Koguryo influence was also strong. And we know up in the area, up around northern Japan, Arashiyama, no, not Arashiyama, over by Oyama, anyway, up in, I can't think of the name right now, but up near Shimane, there were people that would come down from Koguryo. And this is in the Nara period. There were links back and forth that way. But anyway, let me go back to this to show you the cultural transfer that's going on between Southern Korea and relics in what we know today in Japan. The one on the top is the Korean saddle. It's a saddle in the back of, you think of a saddle, and this is the back of the saddle that you're seeing. And this is a 6th century artifact. And a similar artifact was excavated from Fujinoki, which is a tomb in the Nara area from the 7th century. And so you see, they're very, very similar. Obviously, a century later, it's slightly more refined, but obviously they're making the same things. Or in pottery, the ones on the left are the Korean potteries from roughly the same period. About a century later is the pottery from a Japanese tomb. So again, you see very, very close similarities in what they're producing. Now, just to get everything straight, 6th century, roughly 500 or so, this is what the Korean Peninsula looked like. And Koguryo was obviously quite large, and Paekje over on the left, Shilla over on the right, and Kaya was still there. Kaya ultimately gets absorbed into Shilla, and then Shilla also absorbs Paekje, and then Shilla also goes on and absorbs the southern part of Koguryo. But that's a story for later. but what we see in particular is an especially strong tie between Pekche and the islands. Sorry, wrong stream. And we know, for example, that Buddhism comes in from Pekche roughly 550. It's pretty clearly delineated in the Nihon Shoki and in the Japanese sources. They also talk about the writing system was brought in by a particular individual who lived in the southwestern part of the Korean peninsula by the name of Wang In. And there's a whole slew of artisans that come in. And as Pekche is taken over by Shilla, we have a fairly significant migration of people moving from the Pekche region over into the Nara and the Fukuoka Kyushu area. And so it's a fairly massive migration. And if you travel today in the Kansai area, you'll find lots of references like to Pekche Kudara-dera, which is Pekche-sa, and all sorts of different things related to, in which we clearly can see a Korean influence. Horyuji, which is one of Japan's greatest temples, was largely designed by Korean artisans. And so these are just an example of how the people from the peninsula were playing a major role in getting the early cultures going, the early states going in Japan. One of the most interesting finds was in the 1970s when this tomb called Takamatsuzuka was uncovered. And this is in just south of Nara Prefecture. And when this was uncovered, they brought in scholars from both North Korea and South Korea. And the North Koreans said, well, this was obviously designed by Koguryo artisans. And the people from South Korea said, no, it seems to have been designed by artisans from Pekche. Now, for those of you who are reading your Chinese characters, I want to point out somehow or other the painting the photo got shifted, and so it's backwards. And what you see on the right should be on the left, and what you see on the left should be on the right. So if you look at those characters, you're not going blind. It's just that they're backwards. And so this particular picture of the women who you see that back there in the far right is enlarged here, and you find very, very similar motifs in Korean tombs, both from the Pekche area and from the Koguryo area. And this is just some tombs. The snake and the dragon, the snake and the tortoise is a major theme that you find in Koguryo tombs and kings like that. You find in Pekche tombs. So whether it's Pekche influence or Koguryo influence, or whether it's a great deal of difference between Koguryo and Pekche, I leave that up to you. But clearly, the influence from the peninsula is very, very strong. And another way to look at this is at the bodhisattvas. And the one at the top is the Pekche Maitreya, which is early 7th century. And the one at the bottom is the Kanon, as they call it. And this is a national treasure found in Japan from the late 7th century. So great deal of similarity between the two, and it shows you the cultural interchange that's going on. And this just to remind you, in East Asia, Buddhism was one of the great unifiers of East Asia. And they're all dealing and working with similar themes. The big Buddha is one found in China, in the Yellow River Valley. And the one on the upper right is, of course, Sukaram. And the one on the bottom left, upper left, the one on the bottom left is the Nara Daibutsu. And these are all basically from the same time period, making a similar expression in the excitement of Buddhism. What we begin to see, however, is that by the 8th century, that's roughly 700, you begin to see differences. You begin to see a clearer Korean identity emerging. That's with the rise of the Shilla state. And you see in Japan, first the rise of Nara and then Heian. And these become fairly clear political entities, which didn't necessarily exist prior to, say, 600. And as Shilla develops, interestingly, Koreans become the great navigators of East Asia. It's the Koreans that are going back and forth between Korea, Japan, and China. And those of you who are familiar with Enin's travels in Tang China, It's about how this Japanese monk needs to get to China, but he couldn't get there without the help of the Koreans. Because it's the Koreans who were the key navigators. It was the Koreans who were bringing East Asia together. And if you read on, for example, into the Tale of Genji and some of the great literature of the early Heian period, Koreans are often mentioned as a model for culture, a model for development. And it's just some intriguing tidbits in which there was great respect for Korea, although by this point, they were clearly Korean as opposed to being Japanese. And again, coming back to the theme of Buddhism, Buddhism does a great deal to unite the early East Asian world. And this, just to give you an example, this is an example of a Korean painting, but a lot of these Korean paintings also found their way to Japan because the Japanese really admired what the Koreans were doing in terms of art. This is in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. And the whole process of Zen, or Sun Buddhism, as we call it in Korean, Sun basically starts in China. The Koreans take it, readapt it, develop it, send some of it back to China, and then carry it on over to Japan. And so it's just one more way in which the Koreans are really helping, and the Koreans through Buddhism are really helping to create a common culture to East Asia. Then getting into the 13th century, things begin to hit the skids. And perhaps the best example is the Mongol invasions. And these guys are Mongoloids. No, they're not Mongols at all. They're a bunch of Howleys. But the reason this picture was taken, not to reveal my youthful background, but to show the Mongol walls. These are theoretically walls that were built down in Fukuoka prefecture to protect the Japanese from the Mongol hordes. And of course, it was the Koreans who were forced to bring the Mongols over to fight the Japanese in two invasions, 1274 and 1281. And I must say these invasions didn't do much to endear the Koreans to the Japanese. Nevertheless, once the Mongols were settled, things sort of came back to normal, and there were fitful ties, some very pleasant, sometimes not so pleasant, and then exploded, of course, with the Hideyoshi invasions. And for those of us who were in K1, we heard about the Hideyoshi invasions any number of times from any number of people. And it still lingers hard and hard and mean in the hearts of many, many Koreans. And 1592, 1598, terrible destruction. And by the way, for those of you who have a good memory, I showed this particular picture about 3 months ago, and this is the Battle of Dongdae, in which the Japanese are on the outside trying to break in and capture Dongdae fortress. Along with the invasions, along with the destruction, realize there was also cultural exchange. Pottery, for example, the Japanese really valued Korean pottery, and they captured a lot of Korean potters and took them to Japan. And Japan's modern pottery industry in Kyushu is really based upon its Korean forebears. Do I have time to transgress for just a second? About 20 years ago, I was working on a program called Treasured Above Gold. And the theme was talking about how it's how the Korean potters built the Japanese ceramic industry and how many of them were captured. And there was a Smithsonian curator who was reading through this proposal and said, no, the Koreans gladly went to Japan. They were not pulled to Japan. They came there to take place in a higher culture. And that was basically what the view was. Japan was the higher culture, Korea was the lower culture, despite all the information that we have now. That curator, I think, is no longer there. But it just shows you what Korean specialists have had, the trouble they've had trying to get people to look at history sensibly. Besides the cultural exchange in pottery, Confucianism also, the Neo-Confucianism that was being practiced in Korea and in China comes in and is adapted by some of the Tokugawa shoguns as a good way for administration. During the Tokugawa period, the ties between Japan and Korea become somewhat more stabilized. there were 12 official embassies in which Koreans would go to Japan and pay and visit the shogun in Tokyo. And this is particular, can I enlarge that? Yeah, this is a scene of the Koreans going to Tokyo in one of their slides. And a lot of the exchanges with Japan went through Tsushima Island. And Tsushima is the island I mentioned before that you can see from Busan. And it becomes sort of a major source of contact between Korea and Japan. And we see essentially the restoration of a sense of amity between the two countries. But then we get into the 19th century. And for those of you who remember the 19th century, since we're all reaching that age where people think we were born in the 19th century, Japan was opened by Commodore Perry in 1854. And the Japanese felt very chagrined that they were forced to open to the barbarian West. And so essentially, they wanted to return the favor by opening Korea in 1876. And by this time, the Japanese felt they had embraced culture, they embraced Western civilization, and they wanted to bring it to the Koreans. And of course, the Koreans were not terribly excited by this, but essentially confronted with the realities of politics, they had to cede, and Japan comes into Korea. And during the next 25 years or so, Japan is constantly jockeying for primacy in Korea. And it starts with, in 1885, with the Sino-Japanese, with the coup d'etat of 1884, 1885, in which they try to take over Korea briefly. It fails. But in 1895, they come back with the Sino-Japanese War. And it's basically fought over primacy in Korea. And for a while, they get primacy, and then they get pushed out. And then 1904, 1905, you have the Russo-Japanese War. And again, Korea is sort of the eye of the storm. And finally, in 1905, after the Japanese had basically occupied much of Korea, you have Teddy Roosevelt coming in the Treaty of Portsmouth, agreeing with the Japanese that Korea really should become a protectorate of the Japanese. And so this is the beginning of the end for Korea as it exists. And finally, in 1910, this is a picture of our beloved Busan, in which the Japanese military is coming in to take over and thoroughly annex Korea in 1910. We've all known this, you've all heard this many times, so I'm just bringing you up to date, the bitterness of that situation. Now, Japan came in with the idea of bringing civilization to Korea, and they built railroads, they built modern buildings, government buildings, and they built schools. Of course, the railroads were built in part to go take things from inner Korea down to Busan and over to Japan. And that's why you have the Gyeongbusan rail line, which is so far advanced over the lines going to the other part of the country. You also had nice modern buildings, such as City Hall, which were good ways to show the power and the civilization of the Japanese imperial clan. And then they also built schools. This is a rural school, but they built schools. And why? They wanted to help the Koreans learn Japanese. And so what they were doing in the process was trying to make Korea into a colony, into a prosperous colony for Japan. Now, Koreans are a little slow to accept this as the future. And we know initially there was a lot of Korean resistance, and the resistance was beaten down quite harshly. Guerrilla warfare was pretty much wiped out. And then in 1919, we had the March 1st movement, which was another example of Korean resistance. And all such sectors of Korean society participated. And I like this one because this shows you the women were involved very much in trying to bring about the end of colonial rule. We know it didn't work. And we know we went through World War II. We know the Japanese loss. We know we went into the Korean Civil War, the Korean War, and things remained very, very tense between Korea and Japan throughout this whole period. And it's not until our savior Park Chung-hee came to power And he's a good Gyeongsang boy. And he, sorry, bad humor. He basically insisted that they settle their differences between Korea and Japan. And so in 1965, they signed a treaty acknowledging each other. And Korea and Japan, from that point on, South Korea and Japan, from that point on, had diplomatic relations. And there were constant issues coming up between 1965, and I just picked 2005 as a time to stop and look and see where they were. And despite some of these lingering issues, there was sort of a new harmony that we saw at the beginning of the 21st century. A new harmony, in part, Japan and Korea co-hosted the World Cup in 2002. We had the Korean wave taking off, and Winter Ballad with that heartthrob Bae-sama, Bae Young-sam, I think his name was. He became the great hero of Japanese women and Korean women, and we saw lots of Korean films being sent over to Japan, and there was sort of a sense that, boy, maybe things are getting better. Maybe things are getting better. But looking at Korea and Japan today, it's hard to say if things are getting better. And in fact, I think in many respects, the issues still remain. There's the issue of the comfort limit, and that comes up every year or so as some new issue arises. In 2015, Park Geun-hye, the president, and Abe, the Japanese prime minister, thought they had made a settlement in which Japan formally apologized for the comfort women issue. And he offered the Koreans 1 billion yen, what's like $8.8 million, to help resolve some of the issues. The only problem is Park Geun-hye had never talked to the actual comfort women who were involved as to whether they liked this settlement or not. And so when they heard of the settlement, they were immediately opposed. And when Moon Jae-in came in, he abrogated the treaty. And so the comfort woman issue continues to remain. And some of you may recall, as early as 3 or 4 months ago, a Harvard professor astutely talked about the comfort women and tried to whitewash it, which just brought further issues of anger. There's also issue of compensation for workers. The Korean Supreme Court ruled that laborers during the Japanese period need to be compensated for the work they did. And of course, the Japanese answer was, well, we compensated them already, according to the Treaty of 1965. But that's become a very big issue, and it still is not yet been resolved. And then we have the Dokdo, the Takeshima issue, which continues to fester. We have the textbook issues, which come up every other year or so. And all of these things just continue to create a legacy of distrust, a legacy of anger, a legacy of really distaste. And so there's also the fact that politics. There was a wonderful article in the Journal of Asian Studies several years ago charting the anti-Japanese issues to Korean politics. And when Korean politicians feel vulnerable, they often beat up in Japan as a way to rally support. And when Japanese politicians feel vulnerable, they'll talk about those dirty Koreans. Not quite so blatantly, but that also comes up. So politics is a good way to get the tribe angry and get more votes to show that you're the first patriot. So where are we? Where are we in 2021? Soon to hit 2022. Historically, Koreans went to Japan, mostly on their own. Some were sought and some were forced. But you can't argue there's a cultural debt to Korea, or there's a cultural debt to the peninsula. And this can be seen in terms of religion, in terms of art, in terms of politics, maybe even in terms of the imperial household. After roughly 700 CE, we begin to see them separating, and we begin to see a clearer sense of a Japanese culture and a clearer sense of a Korean culture. Nevertheless, they continue to work amicably until you have those major invasions that do cause a great degree of anger and distrust. Korea, regardless, has acted as a filter traditionally for much of Chinese culture because it begins often, not often, but quite frequently, Koreans have adapted Chinese values and readapted them and then send them on to Japan. Today, I would say influence goes both ways. And you can see this, for example, in the Hallyu, the Korean wave, in which Japanese are embracing some things of Korea, and the Koreans are embracing some things of Japan. I know a lot of my Korean friends love to go to Japan for vacations. Why? Well, they kind of feel comfortable in the culture and they like the food. And before things got hardened, a lot of Japanese came to Korea. Again, they like the things were inexpensive. They like the culture. They like the food. And hopefully we can get back there again. And so what I'm saying is, in terms of Korea's past, there's lots of new exciting discoveries every year, but yet we have these lingering issues. And I guess the question is, how can we get these two allies together? How can we get them to be more respectful of each other and more appreciative of each other? And in a way, maybe China's going to do that. Perhaps China will force the people of Korea and Japan to realize they do have to come together to work out, to resolve some of their issues and not use each other as a way to beat up and produce their own political advantage. Anyway, I wanted to stop now before Frank told me to stop, to give you folks a chance to critique, to argue, to tell me, Shultz, you don't know what you're talking about. I know some of you have lived in Japan, some of you know Japan really well, so I'd really be happy to bow out now and hear from you guys.
Wow, thanks, Ned. That was great. You want to stop the share so we can let you field some questions?
Sure.
Okay, so the floor is open for comments or questions.
Richard has a question.
He has to unmute.
Unmute, Richard. You
Don't
can't figure it out.
Don't swear.
Call for your wife, Richard. She. Okay, while you're figuring it out, is there another question or comment? He's looking for his wife.
I have a question.
Diane, go ahead.
I didn't quite understand what Tokto was.
Tokugawa?
T-O-K-T-O.
Shima.
What was?
Tokto.
Tokugawa?
Dokdo. Oh, Dokdo.
Oh,
I'm sorry.
Tokto.
Dokdo. Ah, okay. Dokdo are these islands between Japan and Korea. And if you look at old Korean maps, it's clearly part of the Chosun Kingdom.
Yeah.
What comes in is, Dokdo, by the way, is in the Eastern Sea, which the Japanese call the Sea of Japan.
Yeah.
And suddenly, during annexation, the islands belong to Japan. And very, very strategic area. And so the Koreans, and they've even gone so far to station the Navy there. Japan is not willing to relent. And so
And
that's
under the new Mungyobo system, the correct pronunciation is Dogdo for that island.
How would it be written on the on a Western map, a world map? Wouldn't it be Takeshima?
it could be. It just depends if the Koreans have gotten to them.
Yeah.
You find Ulleungdo on the map. It's sort of southeast of Ulleungdo.
Yeah. It's much closer to Korea than it is to Japan.
From a Korean perspective, yes.
Yeah, well, and from anybody's perspective.
Yeah.
But Japan, the Japanese government and along with them NHK and the media, every time this comes up, they'll say it belongs to Shimane-ken. So it's Takeshima into Shimane-ken. Shimane-ken's Takeshima. Every time it comes up. It's a huge propaganda campaign.
Carl Moskowitz has a comment, and you can just ask it, Carl, and then we'll go to Richard. Can you unmute yourself, Carl, and ask the question or make a comment?
Just unmuted. Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah, we can
sure.
hear you.
Fine. I have many potential comments because this area, the modern, say, after Japan opened Korea, supposedly is an area I used to specialize in. But one of the things I would, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, one of the things I would comment, Ned, about the Japanese intrusion into Korea after opening, and particularly with the Sino-Japanese War and Japan taking preeminence politically in Seoul, is that you also have, if you were talking about influence, a great deal of influence from Japan into the Korean elites beginning in the late 1870s and 1880s, with Koreans, some of them traveling, Yangban from Seoul, traveling to Japan to study, even against the wishes of the government. And so one of the influences from Japan, when people look at the colonial period and look at the Japanese system imposed by force, is you can, in Korean political history, if you go back to 94, 95, 96, 1895, 96, is the so-called Kabo reforms and the idea within Korean elites before, even when Japan had lost its power there, that they wanted to turn and modernize Korea in a direction, perhaps learning from Japan or along that road appears then. So I would just, if you expand this presentation and take the modern 2005 mark and take it back to that time, you do find quite a bit of Japanese influence, that much of which is indicted in the present Korean view of Japan, that these were all collaborators, and the collaborator review goes all the way back to that period now. But that's just a comment about the cultural back and forth and Koreans being interested in things that people are doing in Japan and not just seeing themselves as superior. That's the comment. Thanks.
Hey,
Thanks, Carl.
Carl, appreciate the comment. Now, I hope that encourages you to make a presentation one of these days, since I was just going over your whole field and butchering it. So please feel free to come forward with a presentation.
Sure, one of these days.
Yeah,
I
that was
heard that from Baskerville too.
that was interesting. Interesting comment, Richard. Richard Pankow, we were getting a lot of interference, which is why I had to mute you again. So if your wife taught you how to unmute, why don't you unmute yourself?
You know,
One
It's
way to
just-
do it is just press the space bar. That might, if you've got that keyboard in front of you, that might work.
yeah, he did it. Press the space bar. Leave the space bar down. You know, while he's trying to figure that out, I just want to point out that in lieu of what Carl was talking about, a lot of intellectuals in the 12th and the 20th century also went to Korea. And my own mentor, Igi Beck, who had turned out to be one of the greatest historians of Korea up until he died a couple of years ago, he went to Waseda. That's where he got his basic education. And then he came back. So it just, you know, it's obviously that Japan did play a role in doing things for Korea.
You're unmuted.
Oh, good. The comment I wanted to make had to do with the comfort women. When I was there in Korea in 2019 for the revisit, down the street from the Somerset Palace Hotel was a memorial to the comfort women which consisted of bronze, I think, of a woman sitting in a chair with an empty chair next to her, facing the Japanese embassy. And behind them was a bulletin board filled with pictures of young women. But I think those, I'm not quite sure what they were there. Every Wednesday morning at 9 o'clock, there was a large demonstration against the Japanese and against the Korean government for having the settlement. And this was by the tour guide talking about that. That Wednesday I was there as we departed for the day's activities. You could see the demonstration going on. So, yeah, that's still, as you mentioned, that a hot issue.
The Japanese insist that this is in front of the Japanese embassy. At the time, between that statue and the building holding the Japanese embassy, which faced the opposite direction, there was this huge construction going on. Now, I don't know if that's the new Japanese embassy or not. I don't know. But it certainly at that point was not in front of the Japanese embassy. If the Japanese chose to ignore it, they could have. They're not looking at it every time they walk out the door. My daughter participates in those demonstrations sometimes, and I signed their petition.
I'm not sure if they're still having those on Wednesdays, but the statues are still around.
Oh, the statue is there.
Yeah.
Permanently, I
There's
think.
there's statues all over the world. There's one at the beginning of Itaewon. And during the winter, people put, earmuffs and, different gloves and so forth
It's cold in
to
Korea.
comfort the comfort woman. Yeah.
There's one in Glendale, in fact, just east of LA.
Right.
Oh.
And the Japanese government chooses to complain to the various governments where these are. They've broken off sister relationships with some city or some other in the States because they wouldn't take it down, this kind of thing. I'm sorry, but I think the Japanese are wrong. I think it's very wrong.
There's also a wonderful documentary of comfort women, not only from Korea, but other countries that were occupied by Japan. They went to the UN Commission on Human something. And there's this wonderful documentary that I've seen about the comfort women and how from various countries they've tried to get some resolution to this issue.
Okay,
It's
great.
not Korea.
Okay. Any other question or comment before we break into discussion rooms, breakout rooms?
Yeah, I wonder if Ned can talk a little bit about how Chinese culture was diffused through the Koryo and then down the peninsula. He didn't talk very much about Koryo because my understanding is that kingdom lasted for a great deal of time.
Right. Ned's never been accused of ignoring Koryo before, but that's a first. Ned?
Okay, real quickly, just to give you, there were not a lot of constant ties in Koryo, other than, of course, the Mongol invasions. But they did go back and forth, embassies occasionally. There were often examples of marauders coming in and bothering the east coast of Korea, Gyeongju and further south. But nevertheless, in Koryo, that's when you have the Sun or Zen Buddhism really taking off. And it's Koryo monks who often are taking Buddhism over to Japan, and Japanese monks coming to Korea to study more about Buddhism. So that's just one example. The pottery in Koryo doesn't really take off in Japan. It's really in the Chosun period that you see the big pottery exchanges occurring. But it's much more in terms of Buddhist exchanges. And that, of course, Buddhism was sort of the intellectual center for much of Koryo life. And so that's primarily the most important part. But it'd be interesting to see Jonathan Best. I don't know if any of you know him, but he studied Peck jail a lot. And he was asking me a couple of months ago, to what degree are there contacts between Korea and Japan in the official dynastic records? And there's actually very, very few records in the Koryosa Jelyo talking about it, other than, of course, the Mongol invasions. And that's where it really comes into play much larger. Yeah, interesting question, though. Now I think I'll have to go and do some research.
Okay,
You, Mike.
great. So we haven't broken up. Thanks, Ned. That was really interesting. And we haven't, Diane never showed up. Diane Odell never showed up today. So I'll send her the suggestion. Please send, does everybody have, you must have Diane's address because she sends out messages all the time. So if you would like a copy of Dave McCann's newest book of pottery, a digital copy, please send a note to Diane and she'll forward those requests to Dave McCann. Dave McCann will be our next presenter 2 weeks from today. So why don't we break into a few breakout rooms?
Frank, I
Yes.
think we want to get the poetry from Dave, not the pottery, right?
Did I say pottery?
Yes.
Okay, I watched a lot of football last night.
Uh-huh.
Okay, the poetry, the pottery will come from someone else. Okay,
Can I add one more thing before we break up?
sure, Bobby.
You know, people talk about the textbook issue and kind of gloss over it that way. The problem, not only with the comfort women, the forced workers and everything, is glossed over in the Japanese school textbooks. And every time that the social studies textbooks are revised, not only Korea, but anything to do with World War II is getting increasingly diluted. And they're trying to pretend that this never happened. And the Koreans are the most aware of this because of the way they were treated and also because they're so close.